sad, sed, byknon, bekno, gås, ges, gås, gös, chald, gald, ald, ald, warth, warth, arm, arm, owl, all, milk, milk, ferch, ferch, chiriche, girike, bridge, brig, midge, mig, cheese, geze, ich, och, ach, auron, eron, kumon, gumon. Hello. Today I'm here to talk about what I hope is an interesting topic, and that is what would constitute a northern accent in Old English, and I mean pre-Battle of Hastings, not intelligible to modern English speakers, Old English. So, Old English has 4 recognised dialects by modern scholars, which are West Saxon, Kentish, Mercian and Northumbrian. And so today I'm going to be comparing features of West Saxon, which is kind of textbook Old English because that's what so much of the literature is written in, and that's what I'm taking as the southern dialect for the purposes of this video, and Northumbrian, which is the northernmost dialect of Old English, in which there's quite a lot less that was written. So the first thing it's important to point out is that accent kind of differs in terms of how people use it colloquially. So some people are referring to intonation, so the way your voice goes up and down when you speak, but most people are referring to things like vowel quality, so where your tongue is in your mouth when you pronounce certain vowels, whether the vowels are nasalized and things like that. And that's sort of vowel and consonant quality is what I'm going to be focusing on for the purposes of this video, so pronunciation differences at the level of the kind of quality of vowels and consonants. So it's important to recognise that differences in vowel and consonant quality come from differences in how we move muscles when we speak. So this isn't something kind of ethereal that gets layered over the top of how we speak. It's something that's fundamental to how we produce the speech. And so with a language with such a different pronunciation system as Old English, modern things about south-north accent differences are not going to carry across very well in a lot of cases. So what kinds of things characterise a modern Northern English accent as opposed to a Southern English accent? One of those things would be the lack of a foot strut split, so pronouncing the words put and cut with the same vowel as each other characterises Northern accents. Another thing would be a lack of a trap-bath split, so pronouncing trap and bath with the same vowel. Another thing would be monophthongal pronunciations of the face and goat vowels, so something like face and goat, depending on where exactly you're from. None of these things carry across very well to Old English. The and vowels were not separate in any dialect of Old English as far as we know. They split in Southern English in the late 1500s, which I've made a video on in the past. So just like gut and bull have the same vowel in modern Northern English, gut had the same vowel as bulla in Old English, whether you were Southern or Northern. The same is true of the trap and bath vowels. Rat and fast had the same vowels in Old English, whether you were Southern or Northern. The goat vowel across Old English was spelt with an A and was probably pronounced something like gart, and the face vowel was miles away from its modern realisation. It was short in words like nummer until the Middle English period. So modern accent differences don't carry across well at all. So I'm going to go through and slightly condense Falk's description of Northumbrian Old English and compare some of its features to West Saxon, and also hopefully draw out some other stuff. So first of all, what had been an air in the ancestral Proto-Germanic language has stayed largely the same in Northumbrian, maybe raising slightly to air, although it's very hard to draw out that level of detail. Whereas in West Saxon this has generally ended up much lower in the mouth as ah. Sad, said.
In all Old English dialects, a sound change called I mutation, which I've done a video on, meant that the vowels oo and or developed front variants, U and Ö in certain situations. In West Saxon, both short and long Ö became E very early on, losing the lip rounding. But in Northumbrian, the long Ö remained Ö and it kept its lip rounding. So this would be a real accent difference affecting a lot of words. And as an example, the plural of the word goose would probably be different from one dialect to the other.
Gås, ges. Gås, gös.
Now, this Ö quality, or something similar to it, can be found in a small number of Northern English dialects today, where it's the realisation of the goat vowel. Gert, stern. This is slightly more backed than it probably was in Northumbrian Old English. But this won't have come from the Northumbrian Old English pattern because it's in a completely different set of words, and vowel qualities don't hop across lexical sets like that. In Old English, these words were pronounced gart and starn. But it can give you some idea of how I mutation happened in the first place. Early Old English speakers started off saying gorses and ended up saying gerses, just as Hull speakers started off saying gort and ended up saying gert. Again, even in modern Northern English, this is fairly restricted, and most Northern English speakers have a fairly backed goat vowel, closer to something like o. The short U and long EU diphthongs of West Saxon don't exist in Northumbrian. In their place, you'll have another vowel depending on what the Proto-Germanic word had.
Byknon, beknon.
Where you find the short diphthong ow in West Saxon, sometimes instead you just find a in Northumbrian.
Chald, gald.
Northumbrian diphthongs, or gliding vowels that glide from one quality to another, get smoothed or monophthongized when they appear before certain consonants. A becomes a, eu becomes e. Now this is an interesting one that gives us some phonetic clues about other aspects of Northumbrian pronunciation. Traditional scholarship says that in West Saxon and textbook Old English, the l sound became velarized, l, if it appeared before a consonant. The difference l, 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 l. The reason we think this is because if a vowel that usually had a front tongue position came before L and then a consonant, it turned into a gliding vowel, a diphthong, that ended with a back tongue position. Al or el rather than a or e. This kind of thing is common when a vowel assimilates to a velarized l, because l has a back tongue position. The Northumbrian tendency to have a completely retracted to a back vowel a before l strongly suggests that this l was velar. Gald, ald rather than gald, ald. This idea of a velar all in this position lines up with later Northern English evidence. Throughout Scots and traditional Northern English dialects, what was Middle English al followed by a consonant has become vowel consonant with no intervening l. In Cumbrian, the dialect I'm most familiar with, Middle English ald has become odd or old. Middle English half has become half, as you can hear in this Alton dialect survey clip.
Maybe an hour and a half off.
But anyway, Northern English and Scots lost this L between an A and a consonant, and the most common way of losing an L sound is if the L starts off velarized, all, and then becomes a back vowel, something like all. This happens in my own speech. Most of the time I don't say cold, old, I say cold, old, without my tongue making any all sound. In languages like Dutch and Polish, this kind of thing has become part of the standard language. Dutch cold is koud, and although Polish spelling still reflects an older velarized all sound, standard Polish pronunciation has it as a w sound. The fact that the L sound disappeared in Northern English strongly suggests that it was velarized before it disappeared. So Northern Middle English ald, gald probably had velar L. They weren't ald, gald like they might be in a language like German. They were ald, gald. So this is consistent with the idea that Northumbrian Old English had velarized all in old, gald, with only a slightly more backed vowel than the Middle English one. It's common in Northern English and Scots nowadays to have velarized L in all positions in a word. Lesp, lelt, lettle. But along the English edge of the Scottish border in dialects like Cumbrian and Geordie, unvelarized is actually common in all positions with no velarization at all. Lisp, lilt, lal. So it's not a given that Northumbrian Old English had velarised L in all positions. Realistically, there was probably some variation from place to place. In fact, that's demonstrated by Falk's next point. The diphthongs ow, eo, ew smoothed to a, e, if they came before g, or ch, including if there was a r or l in the middle. As far as the r and l go, this suggests that they both had front articulations before these consonants, r, instead of r, all. This causes the back element of the diphthong to assimilate to the front element, and the whole vowel to become a front vowel, as the spelling suggests. But in terms of C, G and H, this is a bit of a mystery because these three would traditionally be interpreted as back consonants, g, ch. So it's a bit weird that they would cause adjacent vowels to take a front tongue position. It's possible that these consonants had some kind of front articulation, so maybe they, instead of being velar in these situations, g, ch, they were palatal, g, ch. Where in West Saxon you have elch, in Northumbrian you might have had elch. Where in West Saxon you had milk, in Northumbrian you might have milk. There's a bit of a chicken and egg thing with this hypothesis though. Did fronted vowels cause the consonants to palatalise, or did palatal consonants cause the vowels to front? On balance, I'd say palatal consonants would have come first because they could occur across the board at the end of a syllable, and then the fronting of these specific vowels happens only on the condition that they're followed by a palatal consonant. This kind of environment-specific change is more likely to have come after, a broader one that applies across the board. But without any developmental evidence that these consonants were palatal in Northumbrian, this seems like a fairly shaky hypothesis. I don't know of any Northern English dialect nowadays where these are palatal. A widely known inference about Northumbrian Old English is that it had much less palatalisation than other dialects. In other words, k didn't become ch as much, and g didn't become y or j as much as it did in the south. And this survives nowadays mainly in place names that have the elements kirk, brig and rig, where southern dialects would have church, bridge, ridge. As a general feature of Northumbrian, this would have given rise to differences like this.
Chiriche, girike, bridge, brig, midge, mig, cheese, geze.
In fact, examples like geze show up in place names like Keswick in Cumbria, which is the unpalatalised equivalent of Chiswick in London. Some palatalisation did clearly happen, especially sk becoming sh, and this is clear because conditioned vowel changes happened in response to this, and also because Middle English spelling evidence suggests that sh went even further and became s in some northern dialects. In low stress environments, g can become ch at the end of a word, and bear in mind this includes g that wasn't palatalised to a ch where it would have been in the south. So in the south, ik palatalises to ich, then ich, whereas in the north, ik doesn't palatalise, and instead it has this lenition to ich. Some texts show an I-O spelling where you'd get an E-O spelling in West Saxon. So for example, in the Leiden riddle where West Saxon would have fleelsum as the dative plural of fleece, Northumbrian has this spelling, and this is recorded in Bede's Death Song as well. So this could be eo, it could be ew if Northumbrian had harmonic diphthongs. I think this is one where we honestly can't say that we have a very good idea of what the quality of this was, sadly. But, we've got to be honest about that. A big thing that might have given you away as a northerner is that the infinitive ending un seems to have lost the n in quite a lot of Northumbrian. And this kind of n loss very often happens because the vowel in front of it becomes nasalised, pronounced with the airflow directed partly through the nose. So this is kind of the n and the vowel combining into one sound, and then the vowel loses the nasal quality and just becomes a normal oral vowel. So where in West Saxon you have queddon, maybe in early Northumbrian it was queddon, and then later just gwedda. And indeed, nasalisation of a vowel is often coupled with lip rounding. You can see this in other dialects of Old English where a gets rounded before a nasal consonant. Mun becomes something like mon. Lund becomes something like lond. Now this is a common thing cross-linguistically as well, so in Polish the nasal equivalent of a is something like on. And in Northumbrian, sometimes this infinitive ending with the n loss is spelled with the letter o, suggesting a similar thing. An interesting thing, with an absolute minefield of possible interpretations, is that Northumbrian writers often mix up the EO and EA diphthongs that West Saxon writers do a pretty good job of keeping separate. There's good reason to think West Saxon and Mercian people were definitely pronouncing these two diphthongs, or four if you count the short versions, differently from each other. Mixing them up would be like a modern English speaker mixing up O and A. They're different phonemes, and a native speaker would know which words had which vowel. It's easy to put this down to early medieval people being less educated than modern people and probably get the speech mixed up a bit. But humans are experts at using their own native languages, regardless of whether we're literate, illiterate, or whatever. It's possible that Northumbrian speakers were mixing up these spellings because the phonemes had actually merged for them into a single phoneme, or two phonemes if you count the short version. Or it's possible that they kept them separate but pronounced them in a way that made it difficult to remember which spelling represented which sound. As a throwaway example, they could have pronounced them separately as ew and ale. In this case, the first element of the diphthongs is different, but they both end in o. So to the writer, it's not intuitive which spelling should be used for which vowel, and he just says, fuck it, people will be able to work it out from context. In a 1946 article by John Watson, he points out that Bede, who's a Northumbrian writer, lists a few personal names where he uses this spelling to represent the sound that in West Saxon is spelled EA and pronounced probably something like ow. This sound comes from Proto-Germanic o, so this spelling evidence suggests that in Northumbrian, the second element of that Proto-Germanic diphthong, the u bit, just kept its lip rounding where it had lost it in West Saxon. So maybe an early difference in accent would be West Saxons saying lauf, where Northumbrians said lauf. Maybe later in Northumbrian, the first element of this diphthong raised to something like air, producing lauf. As in my example, this would still be contrasted with ale, which has a higher first element, ale versus ale, but it would be less clear which spelling you should use for which. Throughout this video I've used unaspirated plosives for Northumbrian, b, d, g, and aspirated ones for West Saxon, p, t, k. Aspiration in the south is described by phoneticians in very early modern English, and it's reflected in German and Icelandic as well. On the other hand, unaspirated plosives are extremely widespread in Scots and traditional Northern English dialects, both in the earliest audio recordings and among modern speakers. It doesn't mean it was necessarily the same in Old English, but I think the simplest assumption is that both styles of pronunciation have coexisted in England all the way from the migration period, and that as long as Germanic languages have existed, there have been some dialects with aspirated plosives and some with unaspirated ones. So there's my exhausting summary of the evidence around the pronunciation of Northumbrian Old English, which isn't to even mention the interesting aspects of vocabulary and grammar that are recorded from texts as well, which I may end up doing another video on, if I get confident enough with syntax that I don't think I'm going to make a horrible mistake. A couple of final points. For none of these features of pronunciation, apart from possibly the loss of word final n, is there any reason to think that they come from Old Norse. This dialect was spoken for a long time before Scandinavians started moving to northern England. Regional accents will just develop on their own, they don't need outside influences to explain them. Sound change happens with or without foreign influence. And in fact the vast majority of sound changes that characterise Northern English don't have anything obvious to do with Old Norse at all. Another thing is that some of these features have persisted to modern Northern English and some haven't. In fact, I think probably most of them haven't. In a dialect continuum like the one you find in the UK, every dialect is influentially connected to every other. An influence from Edinburgh, influence from London, from Liverpool, from Ireland, will just wipe certain dialect features off of the map. Traditional Northern English dialects aren't linearly descended from Northumbrian Old English, although as I say, some features do persist today. Thank you very much for watching, and I will talk to you again soon.